It's this part. Who is Thranduil? Thranduil is Legolas's father, of course, but he has a more interesting backstory than some might know, and also when considering his life, some of it is still a mystery. Thranduil was a Sindarin elf, and he was actually king over Sylvan elves within the woodland realm of what once was considered the Great Greenwood, which eventually turned into what we would know as Mirkwood. When considering he was a Sindarin elf, you may not know what that means. In order to understand, we do have to take a step back, like I've done before in some of the other videos. And so the god of the Tolkien universe is Eru-Ilúvatar. And before the world which Middle-earth resides in was created, that world being Arda, Eru-Ilúvatar created powerful spiritual angelic beings known as the Ainur. And the Ainur consisted of two different groups, the Valar and the Maiar, or Vala or Maya, those being the singular forms. The reason why it's important to have an understanding of that, those powerful spiritual angelic beings assisted in the creation of the world that would be Arda. And they did this with Eru-Ilúvatar through music. And through music, they were actually able to design the world that would be Arda. And after it was designed, Eru-Ilúvatar created that world. Once created, the Valar eventually moved to a place called Valinor. And Valinor was kind of what would be considered a country. And the country of Valinor existed on what would be considered a continent of Aman. And so you had Aman over here and Middle-earth over here. And Aman, including Valinor, is often referred to as the Undying Lands. And again, just reiterating, some of those Ainur who decided to live within the world of Arda, they eventually began to reside within Valinor. There are several reasons why this is important to understand. One of those reasons would be Orome the Huntsman. He is actually one of those Valar. And Orome, the huntsman of the Valar, was one of the Erotar, which means that he was one of the strongest of the Valar. And as Orome journeyed from Valinor into the lands of Middle-earth, he discovered the children of Eru-Ilúvatar. Those children of Eru-Ilúvatar would be the elves. And Orome discovered these children of Eru-Ilúvatar at Cuiviénen, which was the birthplace of the elves. And these elves would be invited by the Valar to leave Middle-earth and to come live with them in Valinor. The elves that accepted this invitation and eventually traveled to Valinor were known as the Eldar. And they consisted of three different kindreds, the Teleri, the Vanyar, and the Noldor. And considering some of the historical background of those elves, which would consist of the Teleri that would make their way to Valinor, before they made their way to Valinor, they had two kings, which were brothers. Those brothers were Olwe and Thingol. Well, as they began their journey towards the land of Valinor, Thingol saw a Maiar named Melion. And we don't know the exact time frame, at least to my understanding, but for a very long time, probably several years, he stayed within that enchantment. And so, in essence, he went missing. And eventually, his brother and the elves that followed him chose to leave, not knowing what happened to him. And they sailed to Valinor and became known as the Teleri. However, Thingol's followers stayed behind. And eventually, Thingol came back to his people. And he and the Maiar, that powerful spiritual angelic being, Melion, whom he was enchanted by, they eventually were married and had a kingdom within Middle-earth. And they ruled over the followers of Thingol, who stayed behind and chose not to go to Valinor, but to wait for their king. These elves and some others would be known as the Sindarin or Sindarin elves. And the word Sindarin or Sindarin actually means gray elves. They were not the only ones who decided not to go to Valinor. And a lot of the other elves that chose not to go to Valinor were known as the Morroquindi. And that basically means elves of darkness. And my understanding is the reason why they were called that is because they chose not to go to Valinor and to be in the presence of the Valar and the Maiar and in the presence of the light of the two trees. This name did not mean that they were evil. It just meant that they did not get to behold the light of the two trees of Valinor, and they did not have the privilege of living amongst the Valar and the Maiar. However, the Sindarin or Sindarin elves are slightly different. Even though they did not get to see the light of the trees, they were able to live in a kingdom that was ruled by a Maiar, that being Melion, King Thingol's wife. And so instead of being elves of light or elves of darkness, they were the gray elves, if that makes any sense, being in between. Or at least from my understanding, that is one reason or rationale for the meaning behind their name. In addition, they didn't completely reject the call to go to Valinor. They just stopped their travels before they actually arrived. And so, in a sense, they were more like elves of twilight than they were elves of darkness or elves of light. So, gray elves. And amongst those followers of King Thingol was Thranduil's father, Orifer. And Orifer lived amongst the people of King Thingol and Melion. However, tragedy struck that kingdom repeatedly. King Thingol was eventually murdered by dwarves over prideful things that he said to them and over jealousy over the Noglamir, which was a necklace that held one of the Silmarils, one of those precious and envied jewels that actually housed the light of the two trees of Valinor. Once King Thingol was murdered, Melion left that place and went to Valinor. While she was there, that kingdom was protected, and once she was gone, they no longer were under or concealed by her power. Tragedy would strike again when the sons of Fëanor would come seeking that Silmaril, and a tremendous battle occurring with many of their people being killed during one of the kinslayings. Those sons of Fëanor who had made an oath that no one should have one of those Silmarils except for them. And they attacked that region because the Silmaril was there. And so it's more than likely that Thranduil's father would have observed all of this. And then lastly, during the last wars of Morgoth, Morgoth being one of those powerful Valar who fell and became the first Dark Lord, during the wars that occurred with him, that whole area and region where King Thingol ruled was destroyed. And so Orifer had to leave his home and travel. And eventually he made his way to the Great Greenwood. And there he would become king over Sylvan elves. And the Sylvan elves were woodland elves. And despite him not being a Sylvan elf, they made him their king. We don't know when Thranduil would have been born. However, most people think that it probably would have occurred sometime in the First Age. And after Orifer became king, eventually he led a great army against Sauron, the second Dark Lord, during the War of the Last Alliance. However, during this time period, unfortunately, he prematurely had his troops advance upon soldiers without being appropriately directed by Gil-galad, which led to 2/3 of his army, including himself, being destroyed. After he was killed, the rest of those Sylvan elves were ruled by his son Thranduil. And of course, we first really come to meet Thranduil in the story of The Hobbit. And in the book, for me, he seems less hardened and less of an absolute enemy to all those outside of the Elven Kingdom. From my perspective, he more willingly participates in the unification of the armies towards the end, whenever they have to fight against the orcs and other armies of darkness. Though, of course, in the books and in the movie, he does imprison the dwarves whenever they set out on their journey to return to the Misty Mountain. And when considering one of the coolest scenes in the movie, when he shows the true form of his disfigured face and explaining that he has already encountered those serpents, those dragons. Well, that actually doesn't occur within the book. However, I do really like that part in the movie. In addition, within the movie The Hobbit, they allude to Thranduil's wife's passing. However, in the writings of Tolkien, we don't really know who his wife was or if she has passed. But that variation of the story does make sense to me, and I do like it. After the events that occur within The Hobbit, and the final battle ensued, Thranduil had other important parts to play within the history of Middle-earth. Within the beginnings of the Fellowship of the Ring, where we read about or watch Bilbo's birthday party and his intention to leave his home there in the Shire and to go on one last adventure. During this time frame, of course, he gives that ring to Frodo. And then after Frodo is given that ring, Gandalf leaves. And then, of course, in the movie, when Gandalf leaves, they kind of give the appearance that he comes back not that long after. However, within the books, he's gone for 17 years. And in that 17-year time frame, they have what's considered the Hunt for Gollum, what I've heard is the upcoming movie that we have to be looking forward to. And during that hunt for Gollum, Aragorn actually finds Gollum during that 17-year time frame. And once Gollum is found, he's actually brought to Mirkwood, to King Thranduil, who actually houses and imprisons Gollum in the interim time whenever they're trying to find out more information about the ring. And it's actually from there that Gollum escapes from once that region or area is attacked by orcs. And then, of course, Thranduil's son, Legolas, plays such a significant role within the Fellowship and within the downfall of Sauron. However, while Legolas is out fighting with Aragorn and Gimli and doing their best to ensure Frodo and Sam have a chance to destroy the ring, Thranduil is actually keeping up the good fight where he lives and at home, because during that War of the Ring, his home was actually being attacked by the forces of Sauron. And those forces of Sauron that are coming from Dol Guldur are trying to advance upon Mirkwood, and from my perspective, make their way down south. So if this stronghold of Mirkwood is overthrown, it would benefit Sauron strategically by a great amount, because the forces of Dol Guldur would be able to travel freely south and towards the back and rear of Rohan and into the north area of Gondor. And so Thranduil's efforts within the War of the Ring were actually pretty important, though we don't really hear of them within the movies. And so that is the story of the Elvenking, the king of the Woodland Realm, Legolas's father, Thranduil. And then thinking about how I might be able to apply what happened within Thranduil's life or what preceded it, and how I might be able to apply that, and perhaps how you might be able to apply that in your life too. A few things come to my mind. One thing to consider is the life of Thranduil's father, Orifer. It would appear that he lived through a tremendous amount of difficulties. However, he doesn't let that decide his fate or his trajectory of his life, all of that tragedy and all those difficult things. Instead, he decides to start over and to start something new. And eventually he makes his way to the Great Greenwood. And through his efforts in starting something new, he, who never had any royal background, became a king. And so he took something that was really difficult and perhaps negative and catastrophic, something that could have set him down a trajectory of negativity, and instead he decided to move and put his life in a different direction. And it was such a different direction, he went from being known of royalty to being a king over Sylvan elves, whom he was not even related to. And so for me, when I look at his character, you could potentially look at someone who literally probably lost everything, and yet he did not let that define him. Instead, he left that area and began a new life. And in that new life, he developed something far greater than he would have ever experienced had he stayed in that old life. At least that's my perspective. And I personally feel like that can be true for any of us. If we've gone through something truly difficult and we've perhaps lost everything, it doesn't mean it's the end. You can start over and start a new life, and that new life may have things to offer you that you could never even imagine. As a small child, my father would read the poem If by Rudyard Kipling to me, and all of those lines of that poem have significant value within my life because of the life lessons my father would try to teach me from the words contained within that poem. And there are a few lines within that poem that state, "If you can make one heap of all your winnings and risk it on one turn of pitch and toss, and lose and start again at your beginnings and never breathe a word about your loss." Those lines mean something to me. Sometimes in life we may lose a lot, we may lose everything, but that doesn't mean that we can't start over and try again. And that doesn't mean that even though maybe our past was beautiful and we lost it, doesn't mean that our future can't be as equally as beautiful or even more beautiful and brighter if we're just willing to let go and start something new, even if that means uprooting, moving, and starting a completely new journey, as scary as that may sound or seem. Thinking about how he became king, I wonder if that's something he ever thought that would actually occur after everything he went through. We never know what's around the corner. We never know what good may happen. Oftentimes we get so burdened by the negativity in our own lives where we might begin to expect something bad to happen. But here's the thing, you never know what good might be right around the corner. From my perspective, I know he's a fictional character, but when I put my mind within the frame of that fictional character, I have a hard time thinking that he would have thought before that time that he would have been made a king. Lastly, that decision to not let losing potentially everything, at least the way that I would observe that, with the destruction that occurred to his home and losing his king and the protecting, guiding influence of his queen, and all of those difficulties that would have occurred and the wars that would have happened and all that he would have experienced, because he didn't allow that to set him on a path of negativity, and because he was willing to start over and to try again, his decisions blessed his posterity. Thranduil would have never had the opportunity to be king if his father didn't have the courage to take up root and to move and to continue to move until he found a place where he could truly start over and thrive. And when I think about my own life and what I want to do for my own family, that's what I want to achieve. I want to start making those decisions and continue to make and diligently make those decisions that are going to be good for my posterity to help them out in their future. But that means that I got to make hard choices and decisions now. Sometimes the right decisions aren't the easy ones, and it may take sacrifice, but these sacrifices now will pay off in the end. At least that's what I believe. And not only will they pay off in the end for me and my life, but they will also be a tremendous blessing for those that come after me. And so it's this part, the life of Thranduil. I think it's pretty interesting.